So there's this moment in the new Effects on Hulu miniseries, which just aired and I'm going to review shortly. And there's this moment where Margot Martindale's character says in this miniseries, which is called Mrs. America, in which she's talking about this political movement that they are starting. And she says, we need to have something specific that we're seeking to accomplish, or this will become a movement about nothing. And I think that that's good advice for political movements, but it's also good advice for TV shows and movies, and particularly for Little Fires Everywhere in this episode, because I think that this season of the show and the show overall seems to be so focused on so many issues that it's in danger of becoming a show that's not really about anything in particular. But before I get into my thoughts on the latest episode, which is episode 7, Picture Perfect, I'd love it if you would go ahead and give this video a like, and if you're interested in seeing more reviews of Little Fires Everywhere, I'm going to be reviewing the finale next week, obviously, and upcoming reviews of other shows, I highly recommend just subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a thing. So, getting into this episode, Picture Perfect, which obviously refers to the family picture, which on the surface seems very, very perfect, but when you look closer, Izzy is giving everyone the middle finger. Very Izzy thing to do. You know, it's kind of talking a little bit about how all these people on the surface seem to be okay, but when you examine things more closely, they all, without fail, have secrets that they're holding on to tightly, and these secrets throughout the episode come out in possibly the most devastating way possible. The biggest thing to happen this episode, obviously, was Elena finally made good on her threat to tell someone about what she's found out about Mia last episode. She at first threatened Mia to expose her in court, and she was pressuring her husband Bill to do it, but Bill chose not to. And this was interesting because it became apparent that Elena's own secret, that she had gone to New York and met Jamie and would have had an affair with him if he hadn't not wanted to do that. That secret Bill has discovered, and that is what he means when he says everyone is going to get what they deserve. And it's interesting the way this is revealed, because the whole episode you can tell that there is something that Bill is not saying to Elena, and she's constantly harping on how Mia has done something wrong and she has to be punished for it, and she has to have the consequences of her actions be served out to her. And Bill seems kind of disturbed by this, and he's not quite opening up to her, and at the end of the episode is when we finally discover why this is, because he knows what Elena really got up to while she was in New York City. And, you know, it's an interesting problem that I feel like a lot of people have, is so often when we throw stones at others, we have things in our own lives that we wouldn't appreciate people judging us for. And every character in this show has something that they could have a stone chucked at them for. And it's because all of these characters have faced pretty hard decisions, and they're facing challenges because of those decisions. But what's interesting is I feel like a lot of these characters' problems would go away, and the show is very obviously trying to communicate this, if they would just open up about their problems. I feel like Lexi, in her conversation with her with her boyfriend, Brian, where it was a very interesting conversation, and there were a ton of really interesting conversations this episode, but they were focused on so many different issues that I feel like my head just started spinning at some point, and it became hard for me to find any kind of focus or any kind of take home. I think that a lot of the conversations will be forgotten because there were so many of them. And this conversation I thought was particularly interesting because Brian made some very good points about Lexi's white privilege and how she's kind of ignored the barbs that are constantly being tossed out at Brian. And it's kind of the problem that Jordan Peele brought up in Get Out, which is that, you know, when you're constantly trying to tell a black person that you're not a racist and you're constantly talking about all the good things that you've done for black people, it's a kind of racism, and it kind of makes them uncomfortable. It's like you're trying to ask them to absolve you of being a white person, and that's just, haven't they done enough for you? Haven't you done enough to them? So Brian finally admits that's why he doesn't like coming over to the Richardsons' house, is because Elena is constantly saying things like, oh, I marched with Martin Luther King Jr., and saying stuff like that just makes him feel uncomfortable, that shows him that she doesn't just see him as a person. But in the context of this conversation, Lexi apologizes, and I felt like they were maybe going to reconcile, but then she couldn't quite bring herself to tell him that she had had an abortion, that she had aborted the child, that she was pregnant with him after their sexual tryst after the prom. So I wonder what would have happened if she had been willing to be open about that with him. Well, we may never know, or it may be something that'll get brought up later. But I ultimately feel like she should have told him. And obviously the person with the biggest secret this episode was Mia, and she was almost persuaded to not testify on Baby's behalf in the trial because of Elena's blackmail, which was one of the most unlikable scenes for Elena so far. I mean, this was a bad episode for Elena. And for those of you who say she's not a villain, but regardless of your opinion on Elena, she, put Mia in this position. But Mia could have solved the situation by telling Pearl the truth. And the fact that she still hasn't told Pearl the truth after all these years, to me, is super unfair to Pearl, because Pearl really deserves to know. And I really felt like Pearl was severely mistreated by Mia this episode. In their conversation where Mia was basically saying, why are you upset that I have all this money and I'm not using it to better our life? Why are you upset that I didn't use it sooner to better our life? Which, quite honestly, it's very, very reasonable that Pearl would be upset to find out that her mother had access to this money that she wasn't using. But Mia's response to this is, did you not get enough finer things? Which I understand that Mia has this objection to how people try to use money to cover up their problems. But the fact of the matter is that they're not living a good life. It's not a stable life. It's not a life that anyone would want for their child. And the fact that she's choosing this and that she might have had other options, I feel like Pearl has a right to object to that. And she should have at least let Pearl know that this was the case and why she was making these decisions. Because Pearl is not like a child anymore. She's becoming a young woman, and she deserves more of a say in her own life. And this statement by Mia, to me, is classic Mia, and it's really passive-aggressive. And if she hadn't said that, she might have beaten Elena the punch and been able to tell Pearl that she had run away from, about the lie that she had told in the past about her secret. But she didn't, and Elena beat her to the punch. And now things are looking really, really grim for Pearl and Mia's relationship. Now, I don't like the way Elena told Pearl or the reasons that she did it. As I said, I feel like she's a complete and utter unsympathetic character this episode. Perhaps a villain. Maybe that's too strong, but I don't feel like it is. But, Pearl has a right to know. And regardless of the way that Elena told her, if I had the access to that information, I could see myself telling Pearl. Or at the very least, I would go to Mia and say, you need to tell Pearl, or I will. And then make sure that Mia doesn't skip town in the meantime, because she's apt to do that. But Mia did some very sympathetic things this episode. The fact that she's bankrolling Bebe during this lawsuit, and that she put her relationship with her daughter on the line to testify on Bebe's behalf, was very unselfish and very, very good of her, and I think it's probably her finest moment in the show so far. Her conversation with Bill during the trial was quite good. I feel like they made the argument better than they have in the past for why Bebe should get her daughter back. Although I still don't agree with the arguments completely, I felt like it was a good argument. And the thing with this show is at least they're putting the arguments out there, because you're never going to be completely impartial when you try to show both sides of an argument. It's just impossible to be completely impartial. Nobody can be. I don't expect that. I think the show is doing a pretty good job of trying, though. And the discussion was interesting because they showed all the bad things that had happened to Mei Lin because of the situation that Bebe was in when she gave her up. But they also brought up things that I thought were interesting. Now, the biggest argument they made was, would any mother, would any parent want to be judged by the things that they may have thought or done in their worst moments as a parent? Which is something, as a parent, I can relate to, because I wouldn't want to be judged for those things. But at the same time, you have to realize there's a limit to how far you can take this statement, because in a situation where somebody physically abuses their child or kills their child, it doesn't matter that it's just their worst moment. There are consequences for that. There are legal consequences to that, and you could lose your child because of that. So you can't just say that we don't judge people based on their worst moments, because sometimes we do, and sometimes we give people grace. But that doesn't mean that there are no consequences ever for terrible decisions. And in this particular situation, when you see the frostbite that was on this poor little baby's feet, I really have to question why the legal system would consider giving her back to her mother. And I personally think that if you took the racial component out of this situation, it would be a slam dunk case for the family that has adopted her. Izzy made some great arguments this episode for why I think that there's a problematic aspect to this white family adopting this baby. One, she pointed out very succinctly, she has a mother. They're not adopting a baby that doesn't have someone. They're not lifting her out of a situation where she doesn't have anyone to take care of her. They are taking someone who has a mother who could take care of her. But they didn't know that when they took her, so should they have her taken back now? That's the question I would ask. But at the same time, when Elena comes back at her with, well, that she's in a better situation now, Izzy very aptly says, well, what makes it better? And Elena doesn't really have a response. She kind of responds in the angry way that she typically does. Now, I probably would have a few questions for my own if I was having this discussion with Izzy. And this is an example of where the show isn't really even-handed. They try, but it's really hard. I know it's really hard. And in this situation, you understand the complexities of it as a viewer. But I think that the ultimate argument that the show and the book want to go with is a mother is a mother, and a mother has a special right to her child in all circumstances, which is something I think can be debated and should be debated, but the show is doing a good job having the discussion, so I'll just leave it at that. Otherwise, this episode, of course, we got to see a little bit more about Izzy and what's going on with her friend at school who's kind of turned her back on her because of Izzy's sexual explorations. And we see this bonding moment between Mia and Izzy, where Mia reveals that she was once in a loving relationship with a woman. So she can, understand where Izzy is coming from and hopefully offer her some advice there. But she also offers her some little bit of pushback and says, you did this art exhibit at school that was supposed to push people's buttons and kind of cause them to react and help them to see the problems with what's going on in the case with Bebe and this family that has adopted her child. But some of what you did in putting forward that argument has problems, like it has racial problems. It's blackface. It's kind of racist. And Izzy says, well, that wasn't what I intended. And she says, well, look, you don't get to challenge people and not have them challenge you back, which is something that I think I appreciate about this show as a whole, is that it does try to challenge people and it's not afraid to be challenged back. So overall, this was a very, very strong episode. It had a lot of interesting scenes. We had a lot of other revelations. The story is moving at a very accelerated pace in this episode. I still feel like they're angling for a second season, but overall, this did bring a lot more of the issues closer to closure and closer to a head. I could see them finishing it off with one season if they wanted to in the next episode, if it's another super jammed, super packed episode like this. So overall, good episode, good discussions. I appreciate the honesty of the show in addressing these issues, even if I don't always agree with their take on them. So those are my thoughts on this episode, but what did you think? Let me know in the comments section, and if you're interested in seeing more videos like this one, please subscribe to the channel. That's my review of Little Fires Everywhere, Season 1, Episode 7, Picture Perfect.